The Universal One by Walter Russell, Book 2, Chapter 5, Elements of Matter. The elements of matter are simply varying aggregations of corpuscular light units gathered together in systems commonly known as atoms. Atomic systems differ from solar and stellar systems solely in dimension. In substance, structure, and appearance, they are exactly similar. It has been stated previously that all effects of motion are repetitive. Mass is an effect of motion, and mass is repetitive, with no change whatsoever in its repetition, except in dimension. A bigger atom, such as a solar system, is not different from an elemental atom of the same tone, except in size. Dimension is purely relative. The laws for small mass are the same as for large mass. The elements are thought to be many different substances, each known by a different name. Each element is believed to be that one substance and only that. An atom of mercury or sodium is supposed to be an atom of mercury or sodium that always has been and always will be that and nothing else. The very foundation stone of modern physics states unequivocally in its explanation of the principles of energy conservation. Not one particle of matter, however small, may be created or destroyed. All the king's horses and all the king's men cannot destroy a pinhead. Matter constantly progresses through the cycle of disappearance and reappearance. Every pulsation of thinking mind brings particles into appearance and relegates others to disappearance. Matter is evolving and devolving, just as all other forms of life are evolving and devolving. A sodium particle is not always a sodium particle. It changes its dimensions in an orderly and periodic manner until it has run the gamut of all the elements of every octave and returned to its own octave. A radium particle was once a light unit of hydrogen and will be so again. Moreover, an atom of any element actually contains within itself all of the other elements. An atom of gold is a gold atom in dimension only. It is not even predominantly of the substance of gold. It is everything else in the universe. Everything that exists is composed of everything else that exists. Nothing exists in isolation. Consider, for a moment, an atom of manganese or an atom of iron, both of which are very similar in structure. Instead of thinking of it as an inconceivably small thing, imagine it magnified until it is as large as this solar system. One would not think of this vast solar system as an atom of any one of the elements, for it is known that all of the elements are contained within it. Yet, this solar system is either a manganese or an iron atom. As nearly as can be determined without precise mathematical computation, and while awaiting the calculation of other dimensions, it is one or the other of these elements. Its plane and extension of ecliptic, its color as a tonal system, its tonal syllable in the octave scale, its endothermic relativity as a charging system, its tonal density, temperature, and other dimensions place it within practical certainty as one of these two elements. Later, when calculations have been made in accordance with the formula, the relative age of this system, its exact tonal orbit, its potential position, plane, ecliptic expansion, and extension will be precisely known. This first volume will not, however, be encumbered with mathematics. The basic principles of motion under which the one living being functions in his thinking are simple, and they must be simply written down. The day of the mathematician will come in the adaptation of those principles. This solar system, being just one huge atom of iron or manganese, and to our knowledge containing all of the elements of the entire 10-octave cycle in their proper proportions, makes it clear that the concept of the elements as separate and distinct substances of exact homogeneity throughout their structures is untenable in this universe of repetitiveness in all of its effects of motion. it can then be seen that it is not the substance itself that determines its effect as an element, but merely its position and its dimensions within its octave constant. It can also be seen that the substance of the element for which it has been named is not even predominant in its own element. This solar system, which is true to the plane as iron or manganese, is not predominantly iron or manganese in its composition. It could not be. It contains vastly larger proportions of many other elements, and yet some cosmic giant might gather up a handful of such systems as ours, which to him would appear as a solid, and analyze them in his laboratory as iron or manganese atoms. Therefore, let old concepts of many separate substances be discarded and replaced with the true concept of the one universal substance of many apparent dimensions, known to man in the language of inner thinking, the language of light. There is but one cosmic substance. This one substance appears to be divided into many substances known as the elements of matter. The one universal substance first divides itself into the appearance of two opposite states of motion, which register as positive and negative elements. Then two more opposite elements appear. Then two more opposite elements of increasing potential and harder crystallization appear. The cosmic pendulum then forms one element which registers itself as neither one opposite nor the other, but is equally of each, a bisexual element of maximum opposition in all periodicities of motion. These seven apparently different substances are but different states of motion of the one substance. They are the 7 tones of an octave, and there are 10 octaves of 7 tones each. In the last 4 octaves are many mid-tones, each registering its own state of motion. Man calls these various states of motion of the one substance by many names, and they appear to be many substances. Chapter 5. The 10-octave cycle of the elements of matter. The 10-octave cycle begins and ends with an absolute equalization of all dimensions of motion. Its beginning is its ending. Creation is continuous. There is no beginning and no ending. The entire 10-octave cycle is merely an orderly and periodic interchange of dimensions. At the beginning of the cycle, the time dimension, which is then preponderant, transfers its state of motion into the power dimension, which in turn becomes preponderant until it is overtaken by the time dimension. High power is accumulated time. The elements of matter are the accumulation of the speed dimension of the universal constant of energy into the power dimension. The effort of electricity to accumulate power at the expense of time is continuous, but spasmodic throughout each tone in the 10-octave cycle. There are 10 successive efforts, hence the 10 octaves. Each octave is a separate and complete sequence of inhalation and exhalation, and the entire 10-octave cycle is one inconceivably extended inhalation, followed by a similar exhalation. Each octave represents a separate effort for supremacy made by the two opposing forces. During the first 5 octaves, the power dimension of the universal constant gradually conquers one time dimension, as indicated by a decrease in radioactive emanations in proportion to the increase in endothermic, generoactive power of charging through absorption or accumulation of potential. Carbon, in the 5th octave, is the endothermic dividing line of the cycle. It is the point where the cosmic billion-year inhalation of the cycle gives way to an equally majestic exhalation of another eternity in duration. Carbon is the point of maximum orbital velocity, which creates the illusion of hardness. It is the point of maximum integration, highest melting point, most perfect in cubic crystallization, most compact in crystallization, and most truly bisexual of all the elements. From carbon to the end of the cycle, there is a gradual conquest of power by the other time dimension, and an increase in radioactive emanations in proportion to the increase in the exothermic power of discharging accumulated potential. The law of the expression of energy in motion for the entire 10-octave cycle is the same as the law for one octave, one tone, or even one inhalative-exhalative pulsation. Each octave is an endothermic, heat-absorbing, contractive, generative series of electric actions, followed by an exothermic, heat-emitting, expansive, radioactive series of magnetic reactions. Each of these series of actions and reactions is interconnected. Moreover, each is interconnected, both simultaneously and alternately. The first 5 octaves are therefore male or electropositive in preponderance, while the second 5 octaves are female or electronegative in preponderance. The law of repetitiveness in all effects of motion is illustrated by comparing the cycle of the elements to the life and growth of man. The first 5 octaves may be likened to the birth, childhood, youth, and growing strength of that evolving idea of mind called man. The 10-octave cycle begins with an absolute equalization of all dimensions of motion and all effects of motion. Its beginning is its ending. Creation is continuous. There is no beginning and no ending. Its beginning and its ending are preponderant in the time dimension, while its middle octave is preponderant in the power dimension. The time dimension represents low potential associated with nebulous, expanded matter. The power dimension represents high potential associated with more closely integrated, contracted matter. The cycle of the elements evolves from low to high potential and back again to low potential. The last 5 octaves represent the decline into the apparent dissolution of the idea of man, culminating in a state often referred to as death, at which point the state known as life begins anew. Every idea of mind evolves and devolves according to the same formula governing the locked potentials of the 10 octaves of integrating and disintegrating matter. This is the law of growth. This is the orderly periodicity of the phenomena we call life and death, which are often spoken of as though they were 2 separate things. In reality, they are one unit composed of a plus action and a minus reaction, occurring in an orderly and inevitable periodicity. Life is merely an expression of the generative power of centripetal force, while death is the degenerative reaction to that force. At the beginning of the cycle of motion, the maximum is in one time dimension, which signifies speed, and the minimum is in its power dimension, which signifies potential energy. Speed refers to the rate at which a state of motion can reproduce itself, and by doing so, communicate that state of motion to the entire universe. Potential energy represents the state of motion of the universal constant of energy, where time dimension has been accumulated through deceleration of speed into power. Potential energy can be likened to a compressed spring that, when released, leaps to its inert state. All elements of matter are potentials of energy held in their respective locked positions by the varying dimensions of their positions within their octaves. To illustrate the gradual and orderly transfer of time dimension to power and visibility, and its return to time dimension and invisibility, consider the analogy of a small mountain brook that flows steadily and swiftly down the mountainside. Imagine the brook of low potential falling swiftly over the cliff into a reservoir where it accumulates high potential by storing time. The brook is the sole source of supply and is presumed to be constant. The variation in its ability to perform work corresponds to the amount of time dimension that has been transformed into power by the storage of time. Forests may be laid low and towns destroyed by the collapse of a mighty reservoir, while far up the mountainside, children play without concern in the stream that filled that reservoir. Similarly, the universal constant of energy supplied by thinking mind operates in a comparable way. Thinking is the only source of energy, Yet the immense power accumulated through the idea of this universe and registered in repetitive systems varying in size from those so small that a trillion could fit in a needlepoint to those so large that man cannot conceive their expanse, comes from that one source and that source alone. The entire 10-octave constant cycle is simply an orderly period of accumulation of the constant of energy into higher power dimensions, which reach their maximum at the 5th octave, followed by a distribution of that accumulation through the succeeding 5 octaves. Higher power is accumulated time. The deceleration of speed in rotation or mass results from generation. Power is generated by resistance to the speed of rotation and acceleration of the speed of revolution. Thus, power is accumulated from low potential of great axial speed to high potential of great orbital speed. Each element is greater in its mass than its predecessor due to the generative power of electricity, which acts as a brake against high axial speed and diverts it into accumulating mass. The elements of matter represent an orderly and periodic accumulation and redistribution of energy. Each element is a tone. Each tone has its opposite. 2 opposite tones form a unit. The 4th tone has its opposite within itself. It is a double tone. There are 4 units in each octave. There are 7 tones in each octave. In these octaves, the accumulation of energy into higher potentials causes such intense centrifugal and centripetal opposition, reaching its maximum crest of each octave wave, that additional smaller vortices are formed. These smaller vortices prevent the ratio of unit increase from being totaled into the 4th tones of these octaves, as they are in carbon and silicon of the lower octaves. The result is that 10 midtones form in each of these 2 octaves, all of which are metals on the plus side and metalloids on the side. These midtones are irregular in all of their dimensions, but their totals added together make the constant of the double tone to which they owe their existence, and from which they subtract their separate, disorderly dimensions. Neither cobalt nor rhodium can attain their proper hardness, true cubic form of crystallization, melting point, plane, valence, nor any other dimensions because of these intruders. Chapter 7. Instability and the illusion of stability in motion. The chemist can solve his problems only through knowledge of the various dimensions of the elements with which he has to deal, their relative instability, and their relative illusion of stability. To write in sufficient detail about the various relations of motion and to organize them as a higher electrochemistry will require a volume in itself, which will follow this one at a later date. Suffice it for this volume that the accompanying working chart of the chemist's 6 octaves is provided here, along with 4 charts demonstrating the orderliness of stability and instability in motion. The universe of motion is a swinging of the cosmic pendulum from the stability of concept in inertia to the instability of the image of concept in motion, and back again to the stability of memory of concept in inertia. Concept precedes motion. Motion begins in concept. Concept takes place in inertial equilibrium. Motion is born of opposition to equilibrium. The universal balance cannot be upset. No state other than equilibrium is possible. The concept of an action designed to upset the universal balance by overcoming inertia is, when executed as an action, simultaneously opposed by a reaction designed to restore that balance. The result of action and reaction is to create the illusion of stability through a division of the force of action and reaction into apparent opposites. An opposed state is an unstable state that simulates stability through motion in equal and opposite actions and reactions. Therefore, stability cannot lie in motion, for all motion is opposed and divided in its opposition. Stability is the inactivity of the state of equilibrium. The dimensionless universe of concept is the universe of stability. The universe of expression of concept through motion is the universe of dimension. The universe of dimension is the universe of the illusion of stability. The elements of matter with which the chemist has to deal are opposed states of motion that become increasingly unstable as they depart from the inert gases, reaching maximum instability at the carbon line. The illusion of stability is least in the lower tones and reaches its maximum at the carbon line. The lower the potential, electric pressure, valency, temperature, and density, the greater the stability of the elements, and the less the illusion of stability. Conversely, the higher the potential, magnetic pressure, valency, temperature, and density, the less the stability, and the greater the illusion of stability. Every chemical effect is an electromagnetic effect. Every electromagnetic effect is a mechanical effect. This universe of motion is a machine in which every mass in motion is a wheel geared into another wheel. Celestial mechanics vary not one bit from the mechanics of man. If one wheel changes its dimensions, all wheels change to conform to that change. The processional movements of planets and solar systems are made with wheels of bevel gears, with cones rolling upon cones and shafts eccentrically placed. The great wheels of solar systems change their bevels and their eccentricities to conform to their positions in the machine of which they are a part. There is but one position in the universal machine in which the wheels run parallel in plane without intersection, without precession, and without eccentricity. In this position in the atom, or its repetition in larger masses, there are no equinoxes, no ascending or descending nodes, and no aphelions or perihelions. This is in the element carbon, where inhalation ends and exhalation begins, where instability and the illusion of stability are at their maximum. There are cone and disc clutches in the universal machine that grasp and slip with the same relative persistence and looseness with which man is perfectly familiar in his mechanics. These qualities give us relatively rigid bodies, such as this dense planet, the more dense Sun, pithy Saturn, and vaporous Neptune. These qualities also give us the same relative rigidities in the elements, such as carbon in the diamond, and less dense substances down through the solid metals and metalloids to their gaseous expansions in such elements as hydrogen and its mate helium. The contours of the cone clutches, which give great surface tension pressure, contract toward the poles, disappearing in the axes and gravitative centers of all masses. The disc clutches, which slip, are the contours of expanding cones. These lose their ability to hold as the cones expand into disappearance at the equatorial planes of all masses. Stability in motion is, therefore, greatest at the centers of all masses and, superficially, at their poles. On the contrary, instability in motion is greatest at the equators of all masses. As a consequence, rigidity in all mass is greatest at its poles, where the cone clutches hold, and flexibility is greatest at its equators, where the disc clutches slip. The cone clutches at the poles of the sun of our solar system, for example, hold fast. That is why the expanded magnetic bases of the equatorial belt of the sun move faster than the contracted polar magnetic bases. That is also why the equatorial belt of the sun is hotter than the polar zones. The slipping of the oppositely moving disks generates much heat. That explains the boiling bubbles we call sunspots, which move nearer to the equator of the sun and farther away again in oppositely whirling spiral pools during each 11-year breathing period of the sun. That is why the corona of the sun extends so far into interstellar space at its equator, and much less so at its poles. That is how, and one reason why, another planet will soon be born to the already pregnant sun. That is why Jupiter has its belts and Saturn has rings, which Jupiter will also have when his axis tilts a little farther to change the bevel gearing of his wheels. That is why Uranus and Neptune are reversing their poles. That is why nature added the gyroscopic principle to her mechanics of motion to create the illusion of stability in her corpuscular solids of motion. That explains the isoclinal lines that run around this planet, forming new bases for the expanding cones of radiation, like the rim of an umbrella which gradually opens until it is in one plane. That is why all masses emanate magnetic lines of force at isoclinal lines and regenerate them by absorption at the poles. That is why the compass needle loses its dip on the zero isoclinal line, which roughly follows the geographic equator, and swings its north pole to the south magnetic pole south of that line, and to the north magnetic pole when proceeding north from it. Motion is an appearance born of the axis of a conceptive cone in inertia. It assumes the appearance of an expanding cone and disappears through radiation in equatorial opposition. The universal machine is a gyroscopic top. When it is in minimal motion, its form is a cone, like a top gyrating unsteadily on an eccentric axis. When it is in great motion, it loses the altitude and eccentricity of its axis and becomes a gyroscope revolving steadily in one plane. The generative attractive principle is the principle of contracting cones. All mass is generated and regenerated by a contractive pressure exerted toward its gravitative center. Its minimum generative pressure is exerted from its equatorial plane, and its maximum pressure from its pole. The radiative repellent principle is the principle of expanding cones. All mass is radiated and diffused by an expansive pressure exerted from its surface. Its minimum radiative pressure is exerted from its pole, and its maximum from its equatorial plane. By arranging the elements in the orderly positions of their relative stability and instability, as shown in the accompanying chart, the chemist can work out his problems much more simply on paper than by experimenting in the laboratory without knowledge of this orderliness. Chapter 8. The Universal Pulse. All motion is oscillatory. The one living being, of which all nature is a part, breathes the breath of life. Every form in nature is but a unit of the whole and sustains its appearance of existence through the life-sustaining breathing of the whole. All mass is life. All mass breathes, assimilates, and eliminates the life-giving property of that breathing. The breathing of the universal one is electromagnetic. All life varies in potential, and therefore all life varies relatively in the electromagnetic voltage and amperage of its inhalation-exhalation pressures. The breathing of the ant is not of the same dimensions as the breathing of the elephant. They vary vastly from one another in time, pressures, potential, temperature, and all other dimensions. The breathing of the sodium atom varies vastly from that of the carbon atom. They differ from each other in their accumulation of potential, as do the ant and the elephant. Similarly, the breathing of Neptune varies from that of Jupiter, Venus, or the Sun in all of its periodicities. The universal phenomena of inhalation-exhalation is a fundamental life principle. The inhalative action is the cause of electricity. It is the generative principle of life, the accumulative principle, the principle of growth, and the endothermic principle. It is the gravitative principle of attraction. It is the principle of evolution. It is the male principle, the positive principle, the creative principle, the assembling principle of the appearance of form. It is the winding of the cosmic clock. It is that which is known as positive electricity, meaning that it is preponderantly and dominantly electric. The exhalative reaction is the cause of magnetism. It is the radiative principle of life, which man erringly names death. It is the dissipative, dissolutive, repellative principle, the decreative disassembling principle of disappearance of form. It is the principle of devolution. It is the female principle, the negative principle. It is the running down of the cosmic clock. It is that which is known as negative electricity, meaning that electricity is magnetically dominated. It means less electricity and more magnetism, as positive electricity means more electricity and less magnetism. This is a universe of more and less in all of its phenomena of motion. The electricity of accumulative inbreathing is the more, and the magnetism of separative outbreathing is the less. The gathering together of the more of solidity is the attractive principle, of which positive charge is the cause. The dissipation into the less of tenuity is the repellent principle, of which negative discharge is the cause. The illusions of motion are many and hard to detect, and the illusions of attraction and repulsion are especially difficult to perceive. The universe of motion is an electromagnetic one. The accumulating potential, which we know as solids of matter, is preponderantly electric. The matter of man's concept is electricity. The void of man's concept is magnetism. Solidity is electropositive. Tenuity is electronegative. The alternating inbreathing and outbreathing of the universal constant causes an alternating change in all mass. The universal pendulum swings toward solidity with each inhalation and toward tenuity with each exhalation. These alternate swings of the universal pendulum are referred to in the scientific world as oscillations. All phenomena of motion are oscillatory. All motion is forward toward the more and backward toward the less. Forward toward the more is always toward solidity and greater pressure. Backward toward the less is always toward tenuity and released pressure. The forward spiral swing of the cosmic pendulum is the positive bound of energy, and the backward spiral swing is its negative rebound. The forward swing toward the plus is always in the direction of north by way of east, and the backward swing is always south by way of west. All energy is renewed from the south by way of east and dissipated toward the south by way of west. To these periodic oscillations, alternating in sequence, are due the revolution and rotation of all mass. All evolving and devolving mass beats time in accordance with its periodic sequences of alternating electromagnetic oscillations. All mass beats time in accordance with its varying potential. The electromagnetic oscillations of the universe are the heartbeats, the life pulsations of the universal one. The universal one is the universe. In every evolving form, mind, the one creative force, is expressing itself. Every existent thing is created by the continuous thinking of mind. Nothing is, which has not always been. The breathing of the one creative force is your breathing, and my breathing, and that of the meadow violet. The universal pulse is your pulse, and my pulse, and that of the giant Betelgeuse. The electromagnetic pulse beats of a light unit may be 30 trillion per second, while those of an accumulation of light units in the mass of our sun may be months apart, just as its inhalation-exhalation period is approximately 11 years. Betelgeuse may have a breathing period of 1,000 years, but time is a purely relative dimension, and all periods vary only in dimension. The pulsations of the universal one are constant in every dimension in all mass. The 30 trillion per second of a light unit would exactly equal the energy of one superpulsation of the sun of our solar system. If the energy developed by the ants in breathings were stored as potential until its time and mass dimensions were equal to those of the elephant, the pressure thus accumulated would exactly equal the power of one inbreathing of the elephant. Electromagnetic oscillations are always an alternating series of pressure increase and pressure release. They always alternate between heat absorption and heat release, between melting and freezing, between contraction and expansion, and between generation and radiation. The oscillating pulsations of the universal force are the basis of the universal power plant. The oscillating swinging of the pendulum between the power of inertia and the equal power of motion is the fundamental principle of universal mechanics. Man cannot conceive any possible mechanical device or principle which performs work, stores energy, or transmits power that is not founded upon the alternating compression-expansion sequences of universal in-breathings and out-breathings. Man cannot use any power other than that given to him from the universal powerhouse. Man cannot achieve any success, evolve any idea, or create any principle other than that of inducing power from inertia by overcoming it and transforming it into motion against resistance. Once carried to this point, its motion will reproduce itself and assist his efforts by the accumulated impetus. Stay tuned for more of the Universal One. Many blessings and love to you all.